Aggression, Gewalt and Terrorism.
Where does aggression come from? Why do human beings repeatedly plunge themselves and others into misfortune and roaring misery and death through their aggression and the resulting acts of Gewalt? One, murder, suicide, destruction, and annihilation. This raises the question of whether aggression is perhaps a form of genetic programming, or whether the causes of it are to be found in different societies, in our own personality, in the different beliefs or political views and opinions of mankind or individuals. Aggression is usually expressed through vicious Gewalt, whereby it can be discharged suddenly and explosively. But it is also possible for it to be consciously accumulated underground and kept practically dormant, in order to bring it to bear at a suitable and specific moment. This process of conscious accumulation is based on a strictly controlled and cold calculation, which is aimed at wreaking havoc at a certain point in time through an evil, violent act of aggression, which can degenerate into a deadly act as well as into destruction and annihilation. This is particularly evident when religious fanaticism, racist fanaticism, sectarianism, religious fundamentalism, political fanaticism, and, in this respect, degenerate thoughts, feelings, and emotions are the driving forces. The degenerate emotions of hatred, revenge, and the desire for retribution are particularly relevant here. These are uncontrolled manifestations that can be directed in all directions, not only in the aforementioned directions, but also in purely personal ones, such as jealousy, lust for power, lust for domination, greed for money and vices, addictions and desire, avarice and envy, etc. Aggressive human Gewalt discharges itself in all areas of life if it is not brought under control, whereby this control over aggression and the exercise of Gewalt is absolutely possible if understanding and reason are used in a healthy, superior, assessing and clearly recognizing manner to control aggression instead of allowing oneself to be controlled by it. Even if this is a very difficult evolutionary process, it can still be achieved if the necessary reason and will are applied, and the great effort, mental and emotional labor, and self-conquest and self-control are not shied away from. However, if aggression is not brought under control, then it unleashes itself unchecked in all areas of life. That is to say, also in the purely private concerns of human beings as well as in politics, and in the excesses of religious, sectarian, philosophical, and secular beliefs. However, aggression and Gewalt also appear in every form of sport, in the education of children, in marriage, in dealing with fellow human beings, in the military and the secret services, among xenophobes and racists, fundamentalists, and all extreme degenerates. The saddest aggressive Gewalt, however, probably prevails in people's private lives, as many family members fight and terrorize each other, but also human beings who call themselves friends or neighbors who are on good terms, etc. If we look at human civilization as a whole, we get the impression that it is unable to curb all its aggression and acts of violence, as well as its terrorist ambitions, and that it has absolutely no control over them. If, on the other hand, aggression itself is considered, then it is recognized that this is an ancient behavioral pattern of human beings, which is also inherent in almost all other non-human life forms. Even the simplest life forms of the lower species distinguish their environment and fellow life forms as friend and foe, and base their own behavior on this. Higher life forms, such as higher animals, measure their strength among themselves through aggressive behavior and thus determine the leader position, the demarcation of their territory or mating power, etc. As a rule, however, this only involves measuring themselves in a fight to determine dominance, whereby, also as a rule, the opponents do not inflict any serious injuries on each other. Exceptions may prove the rule. Animals of the same species do not kill each other unless they are turned into all-consuming killing machines and bloodthirsty beasts by irresponsible human beings through Gewalt. Normally, and therefore according to natural law, animals do not kill each other within their species. The motto is always honest play and fight, with the weaker opponent given up and usually also being left alone and disappearing. However, there is one unfortunate exception, namely the chimpanzees, which are so similar to human beings. This animal species behaves like human beings in many ways. These apes also beat and torture their conspecifics, both individuals and whole groups, causing even the most serious injuries by biting and beating, and also using stones, hard frit, and wooden mallets to beat the victims, who often die miserably or are killed directly as a result of the abuse. As with human beings, hostile groups of chimpanzees can engage in outright warfare. Even defenseless animals are only left alone when they are so injured that they are likely to die, which makes no difference to human beings and their behavior in this respect. Thus, apart from human beings, the chimpanzee is the only other higher creature on Earth that exerts aggressive and lethal Gewalt on its own species. This means, however, that if we are to speak of intelligentum, the two most intelligent life forms living on Earth are also the most aggressive, violent, and deadly. But this raises the question of why human beings are aggressive at all. A human being chooses aggression and Gewalt, or even terrorism, at least in all those matters through which he is somehow more or less hindered or assumes that he is hindered, be it in relation to purely personal and private matters, or through regulations and laws, as well as the machinations of religions, authorities, states, philosophies, any other worldviews, sects, the military or secret services, organizations and schools, etc. Everything that human beings experience as an obstacle, or simply regard as such, for whatever reason, is met with aggression and Gewalt, or evil terrorism. It is enough for it to be perceived as a handicap and to affect self-esteem if someone else does not share the same opinion. If another human being is paid more for their work or has more wealth, if their own possessions and goods, etc., are endangered, if the branches of their neighbor's tree grow into their own garden, if unemployment occurs, if hygiene, order, peacefulness, harmony, or discipline are demanded, or if their neighbor is more knowledgeable, more loving and wiser, has more friends and acquaintances, or has a better job, etc. But it is also enough if another woman has larger breasts, or if a human being is better proportioned. Aggression and Gewalt also arise when human beings of a different race, society, or simply foreign or different beliefs appear. The human being is also characterized by aggressive and violent traits when he or she is hindered in terms of food and sexuality, or in his or her desire for power and recognition, or in his or her plans and goals, or in any other way, or simply assumes that this is the case. This also occurs in relation to a claim of ownership over a human being, when aggressive and violent jealousy breaks out. Unless there is a conscious storage of aggressiveness for a later, devastating, degenerate and deadly, or destructive action, the human being normally decides in a tiny fraction of a second whether or not to react aggressively and violently. And since aggression is an emotion that usually arises in a flash, if it is sudden aggression, also known as irascible anger, the human being also reacts in a flash, as a result of which there is little or no control over it. By the time the aggression appears, it is usually too late to try to control it, so the whole aggressive behavior must be reconsidered and reduced in its dormant state through logical, rational thoughts and feelings. Only then, and only then, is it possible to flatten and eliminate the aggression, neutralize it and dissolve it. However, if aggression has already broken through, it is usually beyond any control. So it is extremely difficult not to act on it and fight it. However, if nothing is actually done about it, then every form of aggression increases more and more, to an immeasurable degree, from which ultimately evil hatred and infernal vindictiveness and fanaticism arise, from which practically no way out can be found. In this case, a human being absorbs the information through all his senses and impulses in the concentrated form of his perceptions, through which the emotions are brought to an uninhibitedly aggressive and violent explosion or discharge. The process is that the perceptions are transformed into stimuli, and thus also into fine electrical impulses. The brain then processes and evaluates these impulses at breakneck speed in order to then reach the thalamus, which embodies the brain's control center, so to speak, at the same high speed via finely branched filigree nerve pathways. Maintaining this speed, the information then races to the so-called amygdala in the limbic system. This is the point where everything perceived and the whole situation is compared with memories, experiences, insights, knowledge, assumptions, presumptions, desires and cravings, as well as experiences, etc. This rapid process serves to assess the stimulus. And this is exactly where the mind would have to switch on and control the instinctive drives if human beings were to make a conscious effort to do so. However, this does not usually happen, which means that an explosion or discharge inevitably occurs, which can only really happen if the aggression is not brought under control in its resting or sleeping state. Only when this happens can aggression be controlled if the stimuli are assessed in and by the amygdala.
One cingulum, two hippocampal gyrus. 3 almond nucleus corpus amygdaloideum. 4 fornix. 5 marmillary body connection to thalamus and hypothalamus. B corpus callosum. R olfactory bulb.
Where does aggression come from? Even in childhood, a certain amount of aggression can be observed in human beings, even though they have had no experience of aggression. So the question is whether human beings are genetically predisposed to aggression and Gewalt. And indeed, this is at least the case for a certain tendency towards aggression and Gewalt, meaning that this can already be seen in infants, even though they have not yet had any experiences of aggression or also no bad or evil experiences in their environment. Aggression is also found in all cultures in which, since time immemorial, it can be established that physiognomic, threatening facial expressions are uniform and an indication that aggression is actually, and at least to some extent, genetically determined. This also proves that the emotions associated with aggression, which can also result in corresponding thoughts and feelings, which is often the case, are the same in all human beings and cultures, and that there is therefore no difference between the different races in this respect. There are innate facets, respectively forms, of aggression and threatening facial expressions, and these exert the same impressions on all human beings. And this is precisely the reason why the vast majority of human beings utilize threatening gestures in one form or another for all kinds of purposes, both in their private and family lives and also in their daily, professional, interpersonal, sporting, political, religious, sectarian, playful, and any other kind of life. The evidence is there that human beings deal with their aggression in different ways. Insight, knowledge, experience, humanity and love, self-esteem, personal peace and freedom, joy and happiness also play an important role, as do balance and harmony, because these factors determine whether control and a certain or complete neutralization of aggression can take place in their sleeping or resting state, respectively. This raises the question of where aggression comes from in its entirety, if it is not only genetically determined. Since human beings have built their forms of society on the basis of hierarchies, religious, sectarian, political, scientific, secret service, military, philosophical, familial, private and various ideological opinions, things, laws, recommendations, regulations and machinations, etc., with which many a human being is unable to come to terms and is therefore at war with them and is also mobbed, hostile, despised, ridiculed, shouted at or abused by fellow human beings, etc. He either turns into a coward or a notorious and psychopathic troublemaker, troublemaker, terrorist, thug and other bully, as well as a good-for-nothing and criminal, etc., whereby other human beings and even entire nations and states, people of other faiths, foreigners and other races, as well as friends, acquaintances, and family members are harassed, attacked, insulted, hounded, and killed, abused and mistreated. The aggressive, rabble-rousing, and terrorizing cannot come to terms with their role in the world and in society, and so, precisely because of their aggressive and degenerate behavior, they fall to the very bottom of the human hierarchy, in the mud and filth of their own wrong attitudes and in their inability to live. They are constantly gasping for air, rummaging around aggressively, violently, and terroristically, thus also bringing death and ruin to human beings and destruction and annihilation to the world, both outwards and into society. Unfortunately, they are unable to recognize, grasp, or understand that aggressive people cause themselves an enormous amount of damage, stress, and destruction. They also have no idea that they produce large amounts of the stress hormone cortisol in their bodies and break down the hormone serotonin, which makes them happy, free, and joyful. So they also have no idea and therefore do not know that this imbalance leads to aggression and Gewalt. This is the case in both human beings and animals, although it should be noted, as already explained, that in Homo sapiens, the human-generated social hierarchy exacerbates aggressive behavior. This is particularly the case when human beings feel or believe that they are treated downwards, when they are actually or supposedly socially or otherwise disadvantaged, when they suffer a loss, or when they are unable to assert their plans, ideas, opinions or views on justice, etc., etc. The forms that lead to human beings becoming aggressive and extremely violent and even terroristic are very diverse, and usually involve both the emotions and also the psyche. All forms of aggression and Gewalt, as well as terrorism, are also subject to all the rules of all levels of society, such as prohibitions, regulations, laws and recommendations, behavioral norms and moral concepts, etc. And these cannot be reconciled with aggression and Gewalt, which is why it does not matter which forms lead to them. The human being's genetically innate aggressive and violent tendencies, etc., are culturally attenuated by social rules, norms, laws and recommendations, as well as by punishment and the threat of punishment, etc., while culturally attractive impulses and socially compliant behavioral dispositions, etc., are praised and encouraged by states, organizations, governments, the military, schools and religions, as well as sects and secret services, and therefore also by all societies. These include, for example, reconciliation, peace, freedom, music, literature, cheerfulness, friendliness, helpfulness, love and humanity, etc., if things are done properly. And it is indeed undeniable that promoting these values reduces aggression and Gewalt and promotes love, peace and human connection. Small gestures of love, friendship, solidarity, joy, freedom and harmony, equality and equal rights, humanity and understanding, etc., have great effects in all cultures. And indeed, these mechanisms that inhibit aggression and Gewalt can be found in all cultures around the world. And it is also effectively the case that they are essential for the coexistence of all human beings of all races and faiths, all opinions and all political, religious, sectarian, philosophical, military, sacred service, private, personal and all other ideological views and behaviors, etc. The truth is that the human beings of all races and faiths, etc., are essential for coexistence. The truth is that societies, peoples and humanity as a whole have a real chance of survival if all aggression, violence, hatred, the desire for revenge and retribution, fanaticism, bondage, religious and sectarian fundamentalism, state, military and secret service lust for power, envy, excessive overpopulation, and hatred of foreigners, races, and people of other faiths are tamed and eradicated. Unfortunately, however, hardly anyone thinks about all these things in order to responsibly and conscientiously change themselves for the better. Because the truth is that every human being thinks he is better than his neighbor, and that everyone is only able to think for their own good, but no further than the tip of their nose. Hardly any human being thinks for the better, neither in relation to himself nor in relation to his fellow human beings. For this reason, good social norms continue to be broken and trampled underfoot without a second thought, unless the social norms themselves have degenerated, for example, with regard to the use of torture and the death penalty. Thus, norms and all law are broken, in the worst cases through murder, manslaughter and war, as well as through sheer terror, both within one's own family, circle of acquaintances and friends, within one's own country and people, within one's own society and culture, but also with regard to foreign human beings, peoples, countries, cultures, opinions and religions, etc. Anyone who is targeted for any reason becomes a target. Even children and women, the elderly, the weak, and the otherwise innocent and helpless are not spared. In many cases, and even as a rule, selfish, self-important, and self-controlled human beings without any sense of justice, human being or responsibility, let alone any feelings in this regard, are behind such behavior. Behind such actions, however, there are also very often irresponsible, fanatical, psychopathic, irrational, murderous and unscrupulous leaders, cult gurus, power-hungry people, crazy saviors and degenerate demagogues who know neither justice nor mercy, and who must be asked how these human abusers, criminals, deceivers, human beguilers, human seducers and terrorists of a political, military, secret service, philosophical, religious, sectarian or any other kind, manage to breed other human beings into servile, fanatical terrorists, murderers and suicide. What unbelievably profound mechanisms these unscrupulous criminals of capital Gewalt and humanity utilize in order to cast a spell over human beings with their terrorist madness. On the one hand, it is clearly the blazing fear that is fueled in human beings and which takes countless forms. On the other hand, it is the promise of salvation, that murder and suicide will lead to paradise and God's rights, or simply that aggressive, terrorist, murderous, or suicidal actions and missions will offer solutions that will change everything for the better. For example, fear of other religions and races, fear of those who believe differently, and of other cultures, as well as fear of moral decay, fear of the wealth of others, fear of hell and purgatory and eternal damnation, fear of the authorities, fear of security forces, fear of authorities, of those who are knowledgeable, loving, and peaceful, of the wise and of guilt and shame. The insistence is that everything that does not conform to the ideology of the savior or the terrorist power-hungry should be destroyed and annihilated, and that every human being should be murdered. In this way, entire families, groups, peoples, and states are manipulated into terrorism, racial and religious hatred, hatred of authority, etc., using fears and slogans as well as promises that cannot be honored. As a rule, those manipulated are no more violent or aggressive than any other human beings. However, the seducers breed aggression and evil in them to the point of absolute uncontrollability and degeneracy, turning them into slaves of the saviors and political terrorists, etc. The truth is, however, that the seduced are human beings. The truth is, however, that the seduced are human beings like everyone else, but they believe obediently and fanatically, in the conviction hammered into them that they are acting correctly despite their wrong actions. As a rule, assassins, murderers and terrorists, etc., are not degenerate aggressive beasts, but human beings who have been turned around by irresponsible and power-hungry, as well as sectarian, religious, political, philosophical or other confused and insane delusions and ideologies of a madman in order to become ideological perpetrators of conviction without thought, thoughtlessly, obediently and fanatically. Even these human beings are normally capable of feelings, also if they are very conservative in their beliefs or attitudes, and in their whole environment, religious, sectarian, philosophical or political, etc., or perhaps extreme in one form or another. But if they fall into the hands of saviors and power-hungry people who want to dominate human beings and achieve any goals through terror, murder and suicide, etc., no matter what they may also be, then they submit to the criminals against humanity, the saviors, terrorist chieftains, God or other evil-doing authorities. They are willing to subordinate themselves, and this willingness to subordinate also gives rise to the delusion that the alleged enemy must be exterminated with stump and style, because his value is less than the dust that is trodden on, or because he is the lust vermin of the world or the universe, coming 300 lessons before the lust scum, and therefore to be exterminated from the earth and from life. This leads to the fact that in this fanaticism and the bondage to the saviors and the terrorist criminals of humanity, the instinct for self-preservation is switched off and replaced by assassinations, murders and suicide operations, etc., and one's own life and that of many others is thrown into the breach and destroyed. In the process, dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of human beings often become victims when they are crippled or die.
Billy,